Post-Impressionism is a movement that emerged in direct response to the Impressionism movement. I want to clarify before we begin that Post-Impressionism is a very broad term that refers to a lot of different movements. They are generally categorized together because of their similar goals and methods, but aesthetically, Post-Impressionist artists tend to have very distinct visual styles that differ greatly from one another. Here's a list of some important artists and terms. Many of the styles of painting listed, such as pointillism, primitivism, and symbolism, refer to specific subgenres of painting that fall under the umbrella term of Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism refers to artists that were reacting against Impressionism. This movement emerged in the 1880s with artists such as Van Gogh and Cézanne, who rejected the spontaneous, structureless freedom of Impressionism. While they were not interested in going back to the smooth illusionism of Academy painting, they thought that Impressionism was too free-form. They wanted to incorporate aspects of science, thought, and rigor into the new style of Impressionist painting. This is very much represented through the Post-Impressionists' really interesting use of color. Like the Impressionists, they're interested in using color and light in new ways. However, they're not interested in naturalistically recording nature. They want to see what color can do, how it can make the viewer feel, and how you can apply color in new and interesting ways to trick the eye. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But overall, with the Post-Impressionists, it's about applying a new sort of structure to the Impressionist style of painting that's all about looking at color separate from form and separate from nature. In fact, even using it to draw attention to the artificiality of the painting, which is of course the complete opposite of Academy painting at this time, which is super smooth, lacking any sign of the hand of the artists. The Post-Impressionists really believed that color could represent and convey complex messages and emotions without actually looking like real life. In fact, it was more effective in communicating these messages when it didn't reflect real life. As I mentioned earlier, it was a less unified movement in general. The creative freedom of using colors in a semi-abstract way resulted in a lot of distinct styles from different artists. Unlike Impressionism, which largely took place in France, it was also less geographically limited. Post-Impressionism popped up all over Europe. Georges Seurat was one of the main pioneering artists of this style of painting. A Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Chautte, completed in 1886, shows how Seurat combined Impressionist themes and subject matter with a new type of order and stiffness that more recalls classical relief sculptures. The scene shows a range of middle and working class people enjoying leisure time at a public park. We know that these are not upper-class figures because of the informality of the working class scattered in, as well as the proximity of an industrial scene that is shown in the background. Upper middle-class parks were less crowded and would have been farther away from the ugly, industrialized landscapes. Seurat is well known for his particular technique of painting, called pointillism. The painting is entirely comprised of tiny dots of contrasting colors juxtaposed against each other. Like the rest of the Post-Impressionists, Seurat was very interested in color, less in depicting it naturalistically, like the Impressionists, and more in the scientific effect of color on the eye and the brain. Seurat studied the color theory of Michel-Eugène Chevreul, who came up with the law of simultaneous contrasts of colors. It described how when the eye sees two primary colors next to each other, such as red and blue, the eye will visually mix these two colors, creating a blend of them. Think of how when you're focusing on an object, your mind fills in your peripheral vision. This is the same idea. Since the dots are so small and there are so many, your mind can't focus on all of them at once, so it fills in that information with a blurry image. So, for example, a red and blue dot next to each other might create the illusion of purple. Seurat would also often place complementary colors next to each other, or colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel, to create a visually pleasing contrast. We can see both of these techniques being used in The Circus from 1891. The illusion of purple is created by combining small dots of red and blue next to each other, and this is placed next to large swaths of yellow, creating a complementary contrast between the yellow and purple that is visually pleasing to the eye. This is just one example of how Post-Impressionists used colors in new and creative ways that incorporated science and structure while still avoiding naturalism as a goal. Van Gogh is an artist who is credited as one of the founders of the Expressionist style, a movement that is defined by artists abandoning naturalism for a totally emotional expression of color and form. Though he himself was a Post-Impressionist, he laid the framework for Expressionism, just as Manet, a realist, greatly inspired the Impressionism movement. Van Gogh was a socialist whose ideology aligned in many ways with the realists. He believed that the modern industrialized life was alienating people from each other and from themselves. In his work, both through his lively, turbulent, emotion-filled painting style and through his subject matter, he tried to establish a relationship between the viewer and subjects. His use of brilliant colors and dramatic, heavy application of paint in thick, unblended strokes, called impasto, helped to bring industrial and city settings to life. He was inspired by Seurat's pointillism, but eventually developed his own very distinctive style. Like many of the Post-Impressionists, Van Gogh aimed to convey mood and emotion through the use of color. With the colors used in this painting, what mood or emotions do you think that Van Gogh was trying to portray? Van Gogh, troubled by society and his failure to sell any of his art, was also a deeply mentally ill man. He suffered from prolonged depressive and suicidal episodes. He painted this, his most famous work, alone in an asylum from the window of his room. The brilliance of the swirling, bright colors lighting up the night sky create a fantastical, beautiful scene. The clouds and stars, almost depicted in waves, echo the undulating lines of the landscape and the cypress tree at the foreground of the painting. The houses and church are dwarfed in comparison, lit dimly by the bright night sky. Van Gogh felt emotions very deeply, and right up until his suicide, he tried his best to convey those through the bright colors and expressive strokes of his paintings. His content was typical of both Impressionists and Post-Impressionists at the time, but he tended to lean more towards realist themes due to his socialist tendencies. The Sower, painted in 1888, is directly inspired by Millet, a realist painter known for his mostly agricultural scenes of working-class people. Unlike the stark flatness of Millet's painting, however, Van Gogh has brought movement and life to the entire scene through the texture and color of his thick impasto painting technique. The plants on the ground seem to move in the wind, and we can sense the heat and power of the massive setting sun as it casts a golden glow over everything in the picture. In Wheatfield with Crows, we see a similar subject matter, but a far different mood and emotion being conveyed. The sky is dark, stormy. The winding, crooked road gives us a sense of vertigo, of instability and anxiety. If you look closely at the stalks of wheat, you can see that they're all being blown in one direction as though from a sudden gust of wind. And finally, a cloud of crows ascends into the dark sky, an ominous warning of a storm to come. Van Gogh had an ability to convey his emotions, even in compositions without people. And curiously, this is believed to be the last painting before his suicide later that year. Another Post-Impressionist with a distinct style is Paul Gauguin. Though he was a student of Impressionist painter Pissarro, who you may remember from the last video was a painter of mixed rural and urban landscapes, Gauguin was not interested in naturalism. He encouraged abstraction and imaginative use of color, saying, "Don't paint from nature too much. Art is an abstraction. Derive this abstraction from nature while dreaming before it, and think more of the creation that will result." Like Van Gogh, Gauguin believed that modern industrialized society was destroying the connection between people. He worked for a while as a wealthy stockbroker with a wife and 5 children. But when he lost his job, he abandoned his family and decided to establish a career as a painter. He wanted to live somewhere primitive or untouched by industrialized society, and spent the rest of his life traveling to pre-industrial societies in Panama, Martinique, and eventually Tahiti, where some of his most well-known paintings were made. Gauguin enjoyed painting groups of indigenous people in natural settings because he believed these people were living simpler lives, which he found appealing. Gauguin and artists that followed after him painted in a genre called primitivism, which, in an art historical context, refers to the aesthetic idealization that aspires to recreate a simpler, primitive experience. This is a genre that in many ways is an extension of Orientalist painting that we saw emerge in the 19th century. Primitivism, as with Orientalism, is now seen as a problematic ideology for a number of reasons. First, it is a fetishization of people and culture. It is inherently objectifying human beings for their aesthetic or sexual value, rather than seeing them with the personhood of Western subjects. Second, implying that a culture is primitive, literally meaning less evolved or advanced simply because they are not industrialized, is a fallacious ideology that is directly rooted in Western colonialism and white supremacy. Western society, such as the French, were able to justify the atrocious acts they committed by colonizing indigenous groups by claiming to be civilizing these cultures that they viewed as inferior. In the painting Spirit of the Dead Watching, Gauguin has painted a young, naked girl lying on her front, her face an expression of fear. The title and the figure in the background tell us that her fear is meant to be explained by the specter of an old woman in the background, the manifestation of a demon or ghost that are part of Tahitian legends and haunt nightmares. The carved post of the bed and the floral blanket, as well as the abstract motifs in the background, remind the viewer of the indigenous setting. However, many art historians have interpreted the fearful gaze of the young woman differently. Gauguin was very sexually predatory towards the young women on the island, and this particular woman was believed to have been his lover for a time. He was known for his violent outbursts of rage, often resulting in physical violence, as well as his aggressive sexual advances towards young women. The painting has been interpreted as an excellent example of primitivism. The submissive look of fear on the girl's face, her naked vulnerability, and the indigenous Tahitian motifs paint a picture of the culture as weak, submissive, needing to be conquered, while fetishizing and subsequently sexualizing the subject as some sort of exotic prize. In one of his most famous paintings, Mahana Noatua, or Day of the God, Gauguin displays themes of primitivism similar to his previous paintings, with the naked women looking submissive and coy, surrounded by reminders of the exotic setting. Here, however, we can really see Gauguin's interest in the effect of colors. Here he has totally disregarded naturalism in depicting this pool of water, bright oranges and reds and yellows flowing in and out of each other in an otherworldly swirl of colors. This creative use of color by Gauguin and others really inspired the Expressionist movement, in which naturalism is almost entirely abandoned in the endeavor for emotional expression. Another very important artist for the development of Expressionism was Paul Cézanne. He started out as a realist painter, whose work was constantly rejected from the Royal Salon, and eventually switched his style under the influence of Pissarro. Like Van Gogh and Gauguin, Cézanne sought to bring structure to the spontaneity of Impressionism, and was very interested in the effects of color. He painted landscapes, still lifes, and portraits that used bright blocks of color in an unnatural, abstract fashion that resulted in a unique aesthetic style and a major building block for Expressionism. Here, in one of his most famous landscapes of a mountain near his home, he has rendered the scene in otherworldly, dreamy hues of pink, purple, yellow, and green. There is a sense of movement and life in the painting, and at the same time, the objects are heavy and concrete, modeled with thick, unblended brushstrokes that give a sort of weight to the composition. You've probably seen this famous painting by Edvard Munch called The Scream. This painting is part of a subgenre of Post-Impressionism called Symbolism. Symbolism was an international movement that consisted of artists painting in a post-impressionist style that were interested in the irrational aspects of the human mind. They were fascinated by the darkness of the human psyche and insanity, a subject of recent scientific interest by individuals such as Freud. In The Scream, the bright, hostile colors, the dizzying, swirling lines of the background that seem to melt together are all echoed by the distressed figure in the foreground. His jaw is unhinged in a scream as he clutches his face in existential horror and pain. The figure bends and swirls with the lines of the background, and his position at the front and center of the foreground makes his pain and terror immediate and palpable. Artists like Munch were also very important for the Expressionist movement. His portrayal of unbridled terror and anguish is exactly the kind of visual, unrestricted emotion that these artists sought to create. James Ensor was a Belgian artist who was also a part of the symbolism movement. His portrayal here of figures wearing traditional papier-mâché masks for a carnival give the viewer a sense of unease. We cannot see the subjects' faces, but instead these grotesque, nightmarish approximations of humanity. The bright, almost neon palette of colors adds to the general sense of anxiety and malaise. Another movement that emerged out of Post-Impressionism in the 1890s is the Art Nouveau style. It was an artistic and architectural movement that highly valued aesthetic and harmonious beauty over all else. Despite these artists working at the same time as the Post-Impressionists, there is a definite difference in the aesthetic that leans more towards the decorative within the Art Nouveau movement. Much of the artwork, often in the form of prints, contained intricate line work and forms that were inspired by structures of nature, such as vines, snakes, scales, flowers, or insect wings. The goal of this movement was to recreate the graceful, delicate harmony that is found in nature, while at the same time representing modern, industrialized society. This poster of a black cat, completed in 1896, was used as advertisement for a traveling cabaret show called Le Chat Noir. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec was an artist who painted in several genres over the course of his career, including realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism. We can see here his bold, unnatural use of color and the sketchy, patchy brushwork of this painting, as well as the content of modern society, a dance, make much of his work a synthesis of multiple movements. However, he is perhaps best known for his Art Nouveau-style posters. This poster, a series of many other lithographic prints, is done in a loose gestural style with big, bright blocks of color. The sweeping, thin lines of the work are far from the chunky, thick lines that we would see in a Van Gogh or a Cézanne piece. Instead, the lines are thin and delicate, recalling the swirling, lace-like designs of many Art Nouveau pieces. One of the best-known Art Nouveau artists is Alphonse Mucha, whose elegant pastel prints are still popular decorations today. Mucha was very inspired by the forms of nature and integrates that beauty and harmony into all of his compositions. They tend to have thin, crisp line work, flat pastel colors, and intricate, swirling, and geometric forms that recall the structures of nature. The subject matter, usually beautiful women in flowing clothing, has a somewhat classical feeling to it, but more than often also recalls a modern industrialized setting. The way that the lattice work of the vines and swirls encompasses the figures almost has an architectural quality to it. The starkness and precision of the line work also draws attention to the artificiality of the figures, making them look more like animated characters than real people. Post-Impressionism is a vague, poorly defined term for the massive explosion of different movements that emerged at the end of the 19th century as a reaction to Impressionism. These movements included pointillism, primitivism, such as the work of Gauguin, symbolism, like Edvard Munch's The Scream, and Art Nouveau. All of this art was being created at the same time in a relatively short period of history. One of the common themes throughout all of these movements is the creative and bold use of color to convey emotion, a mood, or an optical illusion. Another is the continued interest in portraying the working and middle class in a modern, industrialized environment. And finally, they all represent a move away from naturalism, in different ways, but each movement valued a particular type of aesthetic to evoke emotion instead of faithfully rendering things from real life.